Good afternoon. Welcome to everybody. My name is Joey Gurango, and I'm your business technology coach. I've been doing business technology coaching since about 2011. And in the last 10 years, I've worked with hundreds of startup founders, business owners, and even government officials to assist them in developing and iterating various business models so they can scale those business models into significant enterprises. Specifically, these efforts involve the use of digital technology, or what a lot of people call ICT. Okay. And I became very familiar in the process of different software tools and business applications and frameworks, utilities that were used as part of the technology infrastructure and tool sets of these enterprises. So some of them were pretty good and some of them were not so good. Okay, but before I get into that topic, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I think maybe I should start with a little bit of a backgrounder on how I came to be what I am today and how I got into this business technology coaching to begin with. Okay, so I started my career in software development right around 1979. I was an engineering student at the Bellevue College. And while I was there, I was a tech assistant for my professor in engineering. And one of the responsibilities I had as a tech assistant is that I was the curator of the computer lab. And I spent a lot of time in that computer lab, hours, sometimes even days on end, writing code. And at that time, we used a PDP-11 microcomputer, and I was programming in Fortran and in BASIC. And going through all of that process of working with a mini computer, many of you probably have never even seen one. Working with magnetic tape and even punch cards, I got to really learn the basics. I mean, the fundamental aspects of programming. Um, and when I wasn't assisting people to write their code, I was spending most of the time writing code myself. Again, in Fortran and in BASIC, languages that maybe many of you have never even experienced. Now, my very, very first programming gig was involving a system that was to be used by the students in their next student body elections. And that was my first paid programming gig. The school actually paid me to create this program on the PDP-11 that would manage, that would collect, and tabulate, and produce the results of the student elections that year. It took me several weeks to write that, and I had to write basically everything about it, everything from the input algorithms to the output algorithms to the calculations to the data transformations and even the output where you had the reports and the charts. I did that from scratch, line by line. And every single line of code had to be very specific to what you did and could not have a single error in it because, of course, um, every single line of code was quite precious. I was only working with about 8 bits of RAM at the time. Now, the interesting thing is I was able to get the project done on time and delivered in time for the elections. It was used successfully. So we had our first computerized student elections in the school. And, I don't know if it's a coincidence or if it was just uh, uh, by divine providence, but, I had several friends running for election that year, and every single one of my friends won. What a coincidence, right? That I wrote the program and all my friends had won. Anyway, that was my very first gig, and I was hooked. I loved the experience of programming, of creating something from scratch, and I decided right there and then that that's what I was going to be doing in the future. So when I left that particular college and got my first job, I ended up working for a company called Apple Computer. And at Apple Computer, I was a hardware support engineer, but I really spent a lot of my time working on software, learning more programming languages, learning how to use applications, and not just on the software side. I was working on a project called the Lisa computer, which is a defunct computer from Apple. And in working with that project, I got to work with a lot of different applications. And one of the applications I got to work with was something called Microsoft Excel for the Macintosh. Many of you may not know this, but Excel first came out on the Macintosh and not on Windows. Now, I was totally enamored by Excel. And I got to tell you, it was probably um, when I discovered my first true love. Yes, Excel was my first true love because basically it did for me so much of the stuff that I used to do by hand coding on BASIC and Fortran on the PDP-11. And it did that for me automatically. It had all of the framework that I needed to do programming. For example, it had rows and columns where you could store your data. It had formatting that I could use to improve the presentation, the appearance of the output. It had a programming language built into it. And it even had all these different functions that you could use to do data transformation. So yes, I was in love. My first love affair with technology was with Excel for the Macintosh. And I loved it so much that when I left Apple, the next job I got was another company called Microsoft. And at Microsoft, I got to work on a project called Microsoft Excel for Windows, version 1. And in that particular project, we used a programming language called UCSD Pascal. Now, UCSD stands for University of California, San Diego, which is where that particular flavor of Pascal was built. Now, the cool thing about UCSD Pascal was it had something called the P system. And this P system is actually an operating system. It was a mobile and transportable operating system which you could install and run on any device. The first truly mobile operating system. And I was so enamored by it because it had everything I needed. Not only was it a framework for developing applications, but it had a lot of its own built-in applications itself. This is where I learned about things like relational databases and text processing and ER mappers, entity relationship mappers, all those different programming tools that today we take for granted. But I learned about those under UCSD Pascal. And that was a language that the first version of Excel for Windows was written in, was Pascal. So that's kind of how I got started in doing product development. That was my first product development uh, uh, experience. Okay, so since that time, I've been using Excel, of course, as many of you do, not only as an internal application, like stuff I use for myself, but also as a programming framework. I am so enamored by Excel, as a matter of fact, that it's become the benchmark by which I judge or I evaluate any other framework out there. The frameworks that I look at in software development have to have the same characteristics, the same capabilities, and the same ease of use and utility that Excel had. Even today, I still use Excel as my benchmark when I try to evaluate different frameworks. Okay. Now, after working at Microsoft, I decided to leave the world of guaranteed employment, working for a tech company, and I started my own tech company. And that was back around 1987. I started my own company building software, and the rest, as they say, is history. That's what I've been doing ever since. So today, I'd like to share with you my 3 rules of B2B application development. These are the 3 rules that I've used since 1987. And I use it for anything that I build for my business, whether it's for internal use or external use. Those 3 rules are the following. Number 1, first rule that you have to remember, never build a business application from scratch. Never build a business application from scratch. Number two, always retain controlling ownership of what you build. I don't mean full ownership, but controlling ownership. That means basically over 50% of what you build, you have to retain control over. In other words, it doesn't belong to somebody else. Okay? And number three, use only tools that many other people know about. Use only those tools that are used by many other people. Three simple rules, which I came up with all the way back in 1987, and even today, I am still using those rules in making these kinds of decisions. Okay, so enough about me. Let's talk about you and what it is that I'm assuming you are as my audience. So let's talk about some assumptions I'm making about you as my audience. First assumption is that you are involved in a B2B startup. Okay, B2B, that's a startup whose primary customers are other businesses, not consumers. You derive your revenues from companies and not from people. But of course, the users of your tech, the users of your apps are people. They're human beings who work for the companies who are your customers, right? Okay, so companies don't use software, people do. Okay, but your customer, the one that you derive revenue from, are businesses, are other companies just like you. That's my first assumption about you. Second, you want to know whether the tech stack that you are building your apps on is the right tech stack for your B2B startup. Right, in this case, when we say the right tech stack, right means that your team can produce whatever apps the business needs with the least investment of time, effort, and money. Okay, so let me just repeat that. The right tech stack is a tech stack that allows you to build business apps with the least amount of investment of time, effort, and money. Okay, so just to give you a bit of a deep dive on that, the session after this, I'll be going into a deep dive of that concept because I'll be talking about how we built our tech stack in 30 days. So those of you who are interested in how it's actually done, the nitty-gritty step-by-step thing, you can attend the session after this to get more details on that. So this session is more about talking about what is it. The next session, which I'll be doing, is the one that talks about how to do it. Okay. So my third assumption about you, after the fact that you're looking for the right tech stack, is that you yourself is not a software development expert. You are not a software development expert. You're a non-techie, shall we say, or a medium techie, but not really the techie head of your startup. Okay, so if you're not involved in a B2B startup in some way or interested in building B2B apps, then you're not going to have much reason to stick around after this. And if you're a super duper tech expert, if you're a software development expert with many years of experience, you might find some of the things I'll be talking about to be beneath you, because we're not going to get too techie in this particular discussion. I want to keep this at business level and not at tech level. Okay, so perhaps those of you who are in either one of those camps that will not get much value out of what I'll be discussing, now's the time to maybe mute the volume and turn on your Netflix series and catch up on some Netflix viewing. Okay, but if you fall in these categories of my target audience, if you meet the assumptions that I made earlier, you're the co-founder of a B2B startup, or you have an intense interest in building B2B apps, well, this is the place for you. Okay, and I hope that in the next 30 to 40 minutes, I can enlighten you and educate you on these particular topics. And again, if you find this very enlightening and you'd like to learn more, the session after this will deep dive into the topics that I'll be giving an overview at this time. Okay? So let's get started. Tech stack. Okay, so one of the things that makes developing apps, for me at least, B2B apps, and being part of a B2B startup, I find it really easy compared to perhaps doing apps for consumers, consumer apps, B2C apps. And the reason why I find it so easy is that, well, my target customers, the target customers that we want to sell to, are businesses just like ourselves. So we can really empathize with the situation. We deal with the same kind of problems that they deal with, the same processes that they deal with. And of course, the different parts of the business are parts that we ourselves experience as a business. I can relate to them. So everything from starting from the personas that they deal with. Okay, I can relate to them because it's very familiar to me. So one of the first things that we do when we design or develop a B2B app, of course, is to identify the entities that will be manipulated and processed by the application. Now, for those of you who are familiar with a database lingo, these entities are part of what's called the database schema, but they're not just tables and rows, right? They're not just tables and rows. When you talk about an entity, it's actually a collection of tables and rows that are organized in a way that defines a particular persona in your business, okay? So it's more than just tables and rows. It's more than just records. An entity is a complete object. There you go. So the first component of any B2B tech stack is something that manages business objects. And because these entities that we talked about are composed of both primary and secondary entities, right? We just call them business objects. So just one, business objects. Okay, so if you have a look at these business objects, okay, it becomes quite obvious that there's a technical aspect to them. Okay, there's a technical aspect to these objects. So let's take a look at what these objects are. Okay, you got users, you got customers, you got providers, you've got stock, okay, you've got projects, accounts or financial accounts. Okay, these are the standard business objects that every business has to deal with. And if you take a look at them, there's already a predefined or globally accepted way that these objects are manipulated, processed, and dealt with in the business environment. And the idea is that you need to get, as part of your tech stack, some way to manage this so that it maps the real world. So what do I mean by that? Well, there's different programming tools that do this. ER mappers are a good example, or ORM mappers, object relational model mappers. Okay, but I'm not gonna get into those programming tools. The important thing is that you need to know that there's got to be a way to manage business objects within your stack. So that's got to be something which comes out of the box. In other words, it's not something you build from scratch. So if you're a programmer or your development team is spending a lot of time designing and developing all the properties and characteristics and the methods around a customer, around a user, around a provider, supplier, vendor, or an account, or a project, they're wasting their time. Those definitions have been done. So why would you do something from scratch, which is already available off the shelf, in most cases free? You don't even have to pay for them, okay? If they're already there, spend your time on what's specific to the app and not building something which has already been built hundreds, if not thousands of times before by somebody else, okay? So give you an example, okay? For the user is a typical business object the user has certain things that people expect of it, developers expect of it at least. For example, users need to be authenticated. There has to be some kind of an authentication method for that user. And the users have properties. They have like personal information, which is subject to data privacy, of course. They've got information, properties associated with them. If your development team is spending any time whatsoever defining a user object from scratch and creating code that does nothing but authenticate the user, you're wasting your time. That's been done. That has been developed by somebody else. Just use what's already been developed. To me, that's kind of like trying to create your own word processor when you can get Google Docs or Microsoft Word. Why would you do that? Why would you create a word processor from scratch? Same here. Okay. Same thing with customers. There are certain generally accepted business rules about how customer objects are supposed to be curated, created, read, updated, and deleted. If you're defining that from scratch, then you're missing the boat. And that is true for everything else that we talk about as far as business objects. These are not to be created from scratch. They need to already come to you within your stack, within a framework, ready to use. Okay, so that's the first thing that we talk about when we talk about business objects. The second thing is, if you notice, a lot of these objects, customers, stock, financial accounts, suppliers, these all have sort of accounting implications. And when I talk about the globally accepted business rules, what I'm really talking about is something called the globally accepted accounting principles, GAAP. It's something which has been with us for many, many decades. And is globally accepted, meaning everybody accepts the fact that these are the ways that these objects are treated, how they're processed, how they're used. And so why reinvent the wheel? It's been defined, it's been specified. There are many frameworks out there available already that will already have these predefined, pre-programmed, pre-created, and through either an API or even the source code itself, you can inherit it and use it as is. So business objects, as we have learned, are the basic building blocks of any B2B app. So business object management has to be part of your B2B stack. Every business app will always involve 3 or more of these business objects, every single one. So it becomes quite clear that your B2B tech stack should address these basic building blocks right out of the box as part of the package, so to speak. Okay, your developers should not be designing, developing, writing lines of code just to manage these basic business objects. They should already be there from the very beginning. And maybe you can modify them, maybe you can extend them, but certainly creating the tables and rows, the columns from scratch, I mean, come on. That's been done. So let somebody else do the work for you. Okay. Now, and if you go back to my point about these are ruled by generally accepted accounting principles or GAAP, doesn't that make sense then that your tech stack, if you're in B2B, that your tech stack should already include in it, baked in, so to speak, an accounting app? That the accounting app, which does all of these things and most often will have the business object management framework that you need, is part of your tech stack already? I find it hard to think of any available, at least ones I've heard of recently, B2B app that did not have some sort of accounting functionality in it. It's just hard to imagine that there's no accounting functionality in any B2B application. Okay, so the lesson to be learned here is that your basic foundation for your tech stack will be composed of 3 things, right? It will be composed of your business object manager. It will be composed of some kind of an accounting application, okay? And most importantly, that it's all comes to you already pre-built. So this is the start of your tech stack, the framework. Okay. So if you're not already, if your tech stack that you're using right now is not already integrated with or includes an accounting application, uh, think again. It should be. An accounting app is part of your tech stack. At this point, you'll notice that I have not yet discussed anything about programming languages or tools or even frameworks by itself. Okay, so why is that? Okay, why am I not talking about C sharp versus Java versus JavaScript versus uh, um, Laravel versus Django and Python? I mean, those are programming languages and programming tools. And you're probably wondering, well, aren't we talking about a tech stack? So why, Joey, why aren't you talking about these programming tools? Because frankly, it's secondary. It is not the primary focus of building a tech stack. And I know that for some of you here who have a programming background or are developers or really tech people, I know that you make most of your decisions or you start all your decisions with, well, what programming language am I good at? What programming language do I know? What frameworks have I mastered? And what I'm here to tell you right now is that if you're a founder building a tech stack and building an app for your business, for your startup, that is absolutely the wrong way to go. What you need to first do is amass the frameworks, the apps, build the tech stack first, and then the programming languages and tools will come. Let me repeat that. Okay, it's kind of like the cart and the horse, right? Dapat mauna yung horse sa cart. When you choose a programming language or programming environment first, this is B2B, okay? B2B to, then you're putting the cart before the horse, okay? You need to first think about the tech stack minus the programming languages and tools and only get into that once you have your tech stack. The horse is the frameworks and apps. The cart is the programming languages and tools. And I'll get into a little bit more discussion about that and why that is and our experiences in doing things that way. So again, I'm not going to be talking about programming languages and programming environments and tools in this session. We could have a bit of a chat on that in the next session, but not in this session. Okay? So the horse is the framework and apps. The horse is the stack. Okay? The cart is the programming languages and tools and environments. Okay? So again, let's focus on what we have right now as far as our tech stack. We've got our business object mapper, right? Business object manager. We've got our user authentication app or framework, whatever that might be. And we have our accounting app. So these are things which you should already have sort of like pre-built package before you even get started. Okay? So next, we'll talk about what happens after that. So you've laid the foundation, right? You've laid the foundation for your tech stack by having these three things. Okay. Now that's a starting point, but it's not the end of it. You now have to have some way of manipulating those objects, some way of manipulating what you have as your foundation. So when we say manipulate, we're talking about not just your create, read, update, delete, their properties, the definition of the entities. That's not what we're talking about. Now we're talking about processes. Every business app, every business has processes. And every app that you create for your B2B startup will somehow fall into one of those processes. You need to know those processes. Okay. And I'll start right here by saying that if you do not have a member of your startup team, if you don't have a co-founder who has experience in or is an expert or highly knowledgeable in the domain area of a particular industry, of a particular business, or of business in general, if there's nobody on your startup team among your co-founders who's ever owned, managed, run a business, then you don't have any business being a B2B startup. One of your tech founders or one of your non-tech founders should have domain expertise. They have to have domain knowledge on business in general or business processes in particular. Okay, so you have to layer in all these processes in every business app that you'll be working on. And before we talk about business processes in general, I mean, let's talk about the standard ones. Okay, I also refer to these as our horizontal processes. When we talk about horizontal processes, these are processes that every business has. It doesn't matter what industry you're in, you will have these processes. And they're the ones that are most often the basis for any other process that you might have, which is specific to an industry. I refer to these as the horizontal processes. So we'll talk about horizontal processes first, okay? Some of the more really common ones when we talk about horizontal processes, I have this process that I call O2C, okay? Order to cash. So that's an entire process, end-to-end, where it starts with an order. Customer orders something from you. Customer orders a piece of stock, something you have in stock, whether it's a product or a service. They order it from the business, and there's a whole set of steps that particular transaction and object goes through in order to end up with cash, meaning you collect payment for it, right? So it's not just one transaction, it's actually a series of transactions, okay? So that's one, order to cash. Another one is sales to delivery. You've sold something, the business has sold something for a particular, to a particular customer. You sold a particular stock to a particular customer, and there's now a whole bunch of processes going from the order, the billing, the delivery, the receipt, the OR, and all that stuff until you have the actual receipt, right, from the customer. That's called sale to delivery. Then you've got L to Q. What's L to Q? Lead to quote. For those of you who have really enterprise type business B2B applications, you have to start with a lead, which can become an opportunity, which can then become a deal, which can then become an actual quotation. So L to Q is lead to quote. That whole process that happens before an order is placed is a process unto itself. And that's another horizontal process, because basically all B2B businesses have something of that nature. Whether they know it or not, they have something like that. P2P is purchase to pay. So when you procure something, P2P is procure to pay. When you have something you want to acquire, you procure it. You go through a RFQ, a quotation. You go through a canvassing, so to speak, and then you have maybe bidding, and then you've got the award, and then you've got a purchase order, and then you've got an invoice, and you've got a receipt, and then you pay for it, right? So it's a whole process, P2P. And if you want to think of something which does not really touch a whole bunch of other objects, business objects, I have one for you. It's H to R, hire to retire. And this is the process of employee management or employee engagement, for everything from hiring them all the way to their retirement or termination from the business, the entire employee life cycle. And the business objects that are in use there, of course, employees and accounts, and not much else, unless you count maybe the HMO provider as a provider, supplier. So may kasama rin doon, pangatlo na yon, right? So now you got three objects in there, okay? So these are some of the examples of horizontal processes, which your B2B tech stack should be able to support, again, out of the box. You should not have to be writing, creating these processes, these workflows, the notifications that are part of these workflows. You should not be writing that from scratch. Something should already be there, and you modify it, extend it, enhance it, but don't write it from scratch. I mean, I get very upset when I hear about one of the startups I'm coaching, and I ask them, "So what's on your sprint this week?" We're designing the purchase order system. We're designing the purchasing system of our. And I go, "What? We're designing the purchasing system, but why are you designing it? Those exist already. Reuse what's already there, and then extend, enhance, and get it done faster." Okay, so that's horizontal processes. And if you want to go to industry specific, when you get out of the general overall business and you want to get into industry specific, now you can talk about what we call vertical processes. And these vertical processes are specific to an industry. So for example, in manufacturing, of course, in manufacturing, you have all the same horizontal processes that we discussed earlier, okay? But now we're talking about some processes that are specific to manufacturing companies, manufacturing businesses. For example, we can talk about design to build, D2B. So design to build is a process. So as you can tell, it's the process that starts with design all the way to the product or whatever it is built. There's a process there of designing it and then testing it, iterating through it, kind of like software, right? You design and then you build, and then you can build that to stock. That's another process. Build to stock or build to ship, right? Another one is the P2P, okay? Plan to produce. So the process of planning a production run in a factory, followed by actually executing those plans in what's called work instructions or work orders, followed by shop floor control, how you control the actual running of those bill of materials or the recipes, and then producing. Again, once you produce it, is it to stock or to ship, right? So there are different processes that only exist within that particular industry. And that's for manufacturing. And when you think about all the other industries, like, for example, construction, right? Law firms, auto service shops, right? Fast food restaurants, okay? All of these have processes which are specific to them. So, for example, a point of sale process, the O2C, order to cash process, has a sub process, okay, in a retail environment. For example, a fast food restaurant or even a store, a grocery store, okay, they have something called point of sale, and that's a different process than what you'd see in a horizontal O2C process. So these different industries, they will have other processes that you will need to support in your B2B tech stack. Now, again, I'm not talking about programming languages or tools at this point, okay? To me, what's more important when you talk about processes in terms of what must the startup have in order to be able to execute properly, to operate well, what they must have at this point is not even top-notch engineering talent. It's not even top-notch developers, top-notch, 10x programmers. That's not the most important thing from what we're talking about. The most important thing is the domain expert. That one member of the team, whether they're a co-founder or maybe a consultant or a hire, who knows the processes of that particular target customer the best. That they basically, these are the guys that have, you could say, they have been in the customer's shoes. They can look at things from the customer's standpoint. That to me is more important to have than to have somebody who's a 10x programmer at this point, okay? So remember that. The process, the knowledge about the process is at least equally, if not more important than the knowledge of being able to code that process. Because by using the proper B2B tech stack, there's not much coding to be done, or at least not much low-level coding, highly, shall we say, highly experienced type of coding, like a senior level programmer type of coding, the kind of coding a 10x programmer needs. So it's not going to be required. So one of the advantages of using the right B2B tech stack is that you don't need very experienced, very expensive, and very hard to find 10x programmers. You can actually make do with, average, less experienced, not so senior programmers, because having a tech stack will mean that you're using programming tools and utilities that are, shall we say, easier, maybe even low code in their characteristics, that allows less experienced programmers to produce really good results, as good as a 10x programmer would be able to do. Okay, so I want to emphasize again the fact that the software development framework and the tools are dependent and will be dictated by the framework and the apps. The B2B tech stack itself will dictate that for you. Okay, the software development framework and tools and the languages, they will come out of the framework. So the horse is the framework and apps. The cart is the tools, okay, the programming languages and the tools. Okay, so where are we now? We're talking about. Can we go back one slide, please? Sorry, I just want to make a note here. Okay, so where are we now? We have a B2B tech stack, right? So we already talked about having our business objects. We already talked about having a user authentication. We talked about having our accounting app as part of the stack. I've added 2 now in there. Okay, so the fourth level are business transactions. These are the processes. So your tech stack must already contain a business transaction manager or a business transaction app, something which already predefines the different processes I've just described. Okay, and then of course on top of that, you also need a workflow engine. Okay, the workflow engine is what allows you to go through and modify, extend, enhance the processes that are already there. Okay, because no 2 businesses or no 2 customers will be alike. There will be a need to modify processes. Okay, I'm not talking about modifying source code. I'm talking about modifying configurations. And configuration modifications are done via the workflow engine. Okay, so we now have 5 components of our B2B tech stack that we have defined. And we're still not talking about programming languages and tools. Next slide. Okay, and that's again what I wanted to emphasize. The tech stack that comes first is your frameworks, your apps. Once you've got that, it will define, or it will dictate what programming languages and tools to use. Okay, there are many providers of these frameworks and apps. Believe me, when I started out in 1987, there weren't anybody. There weren't any. Okay, but even back then, I knew eventually this day would come when basically it's like a Lego or construction set. I will be able to build apps by just taking pieces from other existing apps and frameworks, put them together, and quickly develop an app. It should not take me months to develop any business, a B2B app. I should not have to spend months building an app. 30 days is all you need to build an app if you have the right tech stack. Okay, so I want to emphasize again, where's the programming languages and tools here? It will be a result of the frameworks and apps that you choose. All these different providers of frameworks and apps that I've mentioned, whether it's an ER mapper, an entity mapper, an object relational mapper, whether it's a transaction manager, whether it's a user authentication application, all of them obviously were written with some programming language and tools in mind. So whatever tools were used to build those frameworks and those apps is the tool that you will use. Hopefully, and I stress this because it's one of my rules, hopefully the programming language or tool that they are using is one that is easy to learn or easy to acquire, meaning there are people, many people out there who already know that language and that tool. And so it's easy to find those people, okay, whether it's by contract or full-time employment, but you can find them and quickly ramp them up on your tech stack because they already know that tool. They just have to learn from you the domain part, the domain expertise, but they already have the technical side taken care of. Okay, so there you go. That's processes and the tech stack that we have right now. Now, I would be remiss. I would really be remiss if I talked about a tech stack for B2B or anything else without talking a little bit about methodology. Okay, it's you really cannot discuss development in a tech stack, using a tech stack, especially in B2B, without being clear about the methodology that you'll be using. How you use this tech stack is just as important as the tech stack itself. There's a certain mindset, a certain approach that you have to take to successfully utilize your tech stack to build business apps, whether it's for internal use, your own internal systems, or something for customers. You've got to have the right mindset and the right approach. And so let me share a little bit my thoughts about what is the right mindset, what is the right approach. If you're looking at the slide right now, you probably already guessed that the first part of that is using an agile approach to developing software. I don't think any other approach would work if you're using, a tech stack with the frameworks and apps like this, because by its very nature, you're already applying some of these concepts. But if you take a look at the first 4 points in the methodology, these are really the tenets, the precepts of the Agile Manifesto. Okay, in the Agile Manifesto, it talks about individuals and interactions over processes and tools, individuals and interactions, business objects and processes before processes and tools. In this case, when he talks about over process and tools, we're talking about, the management processes. So it's more important that you understand the business objects and you support them, and the interactions or the processes between them, than it is to apply some kind of a highfalutin management, project management, whether it's for one person or for 10 people on the team. Okay, so business objects and processes first before anything else. Okay, second, working software over comprehensive documentation. If you're spending all your time writing specs and requirements for a particular app, more time doing that than actually writing code, then you've missed the point, right? First of all, you don't have the right tech stack because you're writing a lot of code. You should not be writing a lot of code, relatively speaking, okay? But more importantly, you should not have to be writing so much documentation, because a lot of the documentation that you're writing is probably already common knowledge. And by common knowledge, it means that you can sit down with the developer for a 15-minute chat, and you've given them all they need to know to develop, to write code for that. Okay. Next, customer collaboration over contract negotiation. Again, this is a very agile way of looking at things. The best source, not only for requirements, but also for agreements, is direct with the customer, whoever that might be. So conversations with them, empathizing with them, getting their agreement verbally, interactively, is much better than having the best written legal contracts by the best lawyers in the world to make progress in your startup. And the fourth, which is still part of the Agile Manifesto, is responding to change. Being in the tech world and being in a very volatile type of business, which is what a startup is, very volatile, things will change. Things will change on a regular basis. So if your approach is not one which is able to adapt to change, to respond to change, make change as a result, make changes as a result of change, then wala na, mahuhuli ka. You'll be left behind. Okay. The last 2 points on the methodology, I just want to add to that, to the Agile Manifesto. No, first, bottom-up decision making. Users rule. This is why domain experts are so important in your business. Okay, you need to have a co-founder or at least a member of your management team that has walked in the shoes of the customer. They've been there, and that's what I talk about when I say bottom-up decision making. At the end of the day, all software development decisions should be approved by, voted on by the users, the ultimate users. And if you can get that user from outside, great. But in the absence of that, because you don't have customers yet, somebody has to represent the users in the team. And that's why it's so important to have a domain expert in the team, because of this bottom-up decision making. And finally, you have to have an open source mindset. I don't mean open source means use open source software only, okay? It's not so much the open source software itself, but the mindset of open source. What is the mindset of open source? Well, I'll tell you what it's not. It is not must be built here mindset. It is not, it ain't good if we didn't build it mindset. It's not that, okay? The open source mindset basically says that the best source of any software is software made by the community, made by others, software made by the experts. That's the best source for software. Not our team, not our internal team, but the people who actually are experts somewhere else. So it's the idea about open source mindset is that you are cobbling together. You are like a Lego building block. You're putting things together in a way to minimize the amount of investment in time, effort, and money to build your apps. Minimize the time, effort, and money. And to do that, you have to do this. Open source mentality, open source mindset. Get what you can from wherever you can. Now, granted, in our particular case, especially those of us who are in startups, we prefer open source software because, first of all, they're license free. It's cheaper, right? And we don't have big budgets. Now, if you can go out and get systems like, the ones that are name brand, so to speak, and they charge you an arm and a leg for their licensing, then great, do that. But you're adding to your cost, right? So, ibang usapan yan. We'll talk about that in the next session, about how usable really is open source for our projects and when do you use it and when you don't, okay? But the open source I'm talking about here is a mindset. It's how you think about building your product, okay? So that's a methodology. And again, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about how you use your tech stack once you have your tech stack, okay? So let me wrap things up. That's pretty much all I wanted to cover. Okay, let's wrap things up by just reviewing what it is that we have learned. Okay, so let me start with my rules for B2B software development. I mentioned this at the beginning, okay, and I kind of didn't specifically refer to it throughout my talk, but I want to go back to that right now and just kind of touch on these in relation to what I've covered. Okay, number one, never build a B2B app from scratch. Never. And that's a never. That is not sometimes, that's never. You never build from scratch. So as soon as your development team or your developer or your hustler, hacker, co-founders start saying, oh, I got to go off and build a business object. You have to like, whoa, wait a minute. Why are you doing that? Okay. So number one, never build a B2B app from scratch. Number two, always retain controlling ownership of what you build. Okay. Now this is kind of a sensitive topic Okay, because as I mentioned earlier, there are providers of frameworks and apps who charge for those frameworks and apps, even just to use them, not to produce working code, not to produce a runtime, so to speak, of the app, but just for using it. And to those people, I say, good for you. If you want to use those, be aware that when you use a piece of software in your app that you don't own or control, you're ceding the control of your future. You are giving up control of your future, not only of your product, but of your business to that provider. Okay, I won't name names, but I used to be in that exact same situation. I used to use frameworks and apps from a particular provider that was, shall we say, not really proprietary, but basically not free. Okay, they not only charge you for development use of their frameworks and apps, but they also charge you for runtime use, the executables. So in about 5 years ago, I started veering away from that, and I can tell you that the open source provided software, the open source community has caught up with these guys. I'm willing to place side by side tools, frameworks, apps that are open source against any of these proprietary guys. And I think for people like us, startups who really have to be careful about what we invest our funds into, they're good. They're pretty good. Okay. So number one, if you use somebody else's framework, somebody else's app, somebody else's tools that you don't own, that means that you're ceding control of your future to those providers. Okay. The other thing that comes from that, of course, is that if you use their apps, their frameworks, their tools, that automatically puts you in their ecosystem. That means that you will be limiting potential customers that you'll be getting to those customers who have bought in to that ecosystem. Remember that. There are, especially in B2B, when you talk about maybe larger enterprises, okay, they have made their tech stack decisions. And if what you have for them does not fit into their tech stack, which is usually these proprietary guys, then you won't be able to sell to them. So it also dictates what kind of customers you'll be able to go after. So that's why number 2 is so important, ladies and gentlemen. Okay. 3 and third, only use tools that are used by many other people. And I can't overemphasize this because a lot of us will be, we like bright, shiny objects, and we see a new tool, a new framework. Maganda yan, technically, technologically, it's advanced. It has all the bells and whistles that I could dream of. But, the entire universe of people who know about it can be counted on 2 hands, or maybe your hands and your feet, right? It's not a very big universe. And so I would stay away from those. Why? Because at some point in time, you're going to have to get people, whether you hire them, you contract them, or you subcontract to them, or you depend on them in some way. You have to get other people who know how to modify, how to configure, how to support your product. And that requires them being able to being conversant in the languages and the tools that you're using. So rule number 3 is particularly important. Okay, so those are my 3 rules for B2B software development. And finally, let me close with this. Let's just wrap up what we actually covered when it comes to the tech stack. Okay, so your B2B tech stack, 3 things, 3 takeaways from this. Number 1, the tech stack is used for building all your apps, whether they are internal apps, which you should have, internal systems, those are internal apps to run your business, right? And external apps for your customers to use. You should use the same exact tech stack, okay? Don't use something different than what you're using for in-house, okay? Second, selected frameworks and apps that dictate the programming languages and tools from your B2B tech stack. The frameworks and apps in your B2B tech stack should dictate the tools and languages that you use. If the apps and frameworks that you're adopting uses programming language X on operating system X with database Y that runs on Z machines, then that's what you do. Let the tech stack, let the frameworks, let the apps in that framework dictate the programming tools and language. It's the horse before the cart. Do not get them mixed up. And finally, in using the right B2B tech stack, you cannot leave out the approach and the mindset that people have to have within the startup. Number one, it's got to be agile. It's not going to work with waterfall or any other legacy way of doing things. It's got to be agile all the way, which suggests that the people have to know how to run an agile project, right? So that's something which you have to have in your skill sets. And it's got to be an open source mindset. The not built here mindset will not work. If you want to build everything in-house, then you'll be long gone before you catch up with the competitors. And there are competitors all the time. Okay. So the one thing that you cannot allow yourself to be held back by is your tech stack. The tech stack has to be your main competitive advantage, not your liability. Okay. So I hope these learnings are helpful for you. I hope you liked what you heard today, and I hope that you can use what you heard today. Again, there's another session after this. If you want to get into more details, drill down into the depths of what I covered, and specifically how we did it, when I say we, our company, the startups I work with, the founders that I work with, built our B2B tech stack in 30 days. That's the title of our next session, how we built our B2B tech stack in 30 days. And if you really are interested in knowing more about this stuff or just keeping in touch, you can go to my website, businesstechnologycoach.com. That's businesstechnologycoach.com, and you can sign up for my newsletters. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope this was helpful for you. And I'm looking forward to seeing some of you in the next session, and looking forward to hearing more from you in terms of what you think about what you learned today. Thank you very much.